The wind sweeps across the red canyons of the American Southwest. It moves through cracks in stone, whispering through empty doorways carved into sheer cliff walls. No voices answer, no fires glow. But the silence is not empty. It holds stories. Stories of people who once lived high above the ground, tucked into the rock like secrets. They built homes in the cliffs. They farmed maize in dry soil. They gathered in round rooms below ground to pray. Then, one day, they left. Their homes stand still. Their tools remain. Their pottery lies broken on the floor. But they are gone. Why? This is the story of the ancestral Puebloans. They lived long before the United States existed, long before horses, guns, or written words came to this land. They lived between 700 and 1300 CE. That is over 700 years ago. Their world was shaped by sun, stone, and water. They built villages in places that seem impossible, high on canyon walls, behind stone ledges, in places only reachable by rope or ladder. These are the cliff dwellings. The ancestral Puebloans were not the first people in this region. Others came before them, but the ancestral Puebloans left the clearest mark. Their homes still stand. Their pottery still holds color. Their kivas still face the sky. We call them ancestral because they are the ancestors of today's Pueblo peoples, but we do not speak for them. We learn from what they left behind. This video tells how they lived, how they built, how they farmed, how they prayed, and how they came to live in the cliffs. Long before the cliff dwellings, these people lived on flat land. They built homes from stone and wood. These were called pueblos. The word pueblo means village in Spanish. Spanish explorers gave them this name hundreds of years later. But long before that, the people lived in small groups. They moved with the seasons. They hunted. They gathered wild plants. Then, slowly, they changed. They began to grow food, not just gather it. They planted maize. Maize is another name for corn. It came from far to the south, from Mexico. It did not grow wild here. People brought it. They saved seeds. They planted it in dry soil. At first, it was hard. The land was not green. Rain did not fall every day, but over time, they learned. They planted in low spots where rain collected. They built small walls to hold water. They timed planting with the sun. Maize changed their lives. It gave them food all year. They did not need to move as much. They stayed in one place longer. They built stronger homes. They stored food in jars. They made tools from stone. They began to live in villages. By 700 CE, these villages grew bigger. Homes were made of stone blocks. Walls were thick. Roofs were made of wood and mud. Rooms were small. Families lived close. Some homes had 2 or 3 levels. People climbed on roofs to reach upper rooms. They made pottery. At first, pots were plain. Then they painted them. Black and white designs, zigzags, lines, dots. These pots held water. They cooked food. They stored seeds. Pottery shows us how their culture grew. They also built kivas. A kiva is a round room below ground. It has a hole in the roof. A ladder goes down into it. Inside, there is a fire pit. There are benches along the wall. A small hole in the floor is called a sipapu. It stands for the place where life began. Kivas were for prayer, for meetings, for ceremonies. Only certain people entered, not everyone. These rooms were sacred. By 900 CE, life was changing fast. Villages grew bigger. Some had hundreds of rooms. One of the largest was Chaco Canyon. It became a center. Roads led to it from far away. People brought wood, turquoise, and shells. They built tall buildings called great houses. These were not homes for one family. They were for many, or for ceremony, or for storage. But Chaco was dry. Rain was scarce. By 1100, the rains stopped for years. This is called a drought. Trees died, crops failed, people left. Chaco was no longer a center. Now, a new choice came. Where to go? Some went to the north, some to the south. Some went to high canyons, places with cliffs, places with water, places with shelter, places hard to reach. There, they built the cliff dwellings. The most famous is Mesa Verde. It is in what is now Colorado, but the people did not use state lines. They knew the land. They knew where water pooled, where deer walked, where cliffs offered shade and safety. They chose alcoves. These are curved hollows in the cliff wall, formed by water and wind over thousands of years. The stone overhangs protected from rain and snow. The stone walls held heat in winter. The shade kept cool in summer. They built homes inside these alcoves. They used stone and mortar. They shaped blocks by hitting them with other stones. They carried water in jars to mix with soil for plaster. They cut logs from forests far away. They dragged them on sleds, then they lifted them up with ropes. Each room was small, about 6 feet by 8 feet. Walls were straight, corners were sharp, doors were low, people bent to enter. Windows were small, just openings in the wall. They built multi-story villages. Some had 100 rooms, some had more. Ladders connected levels, rooms stacked on top of each other. Upper rooms used the roof of lower ones as a floor. They stored food in sealed rooms. They kept tools on shelves. They slept on mats. They cooked on open fires. Smoke rose to the ceiling, then escaped through vents.
They lived close. Families shared walls. They shared water. They shared work. They watched the sky. They marked the sun's path. They knew when to plant, when to harvest, when to pray. But why live so high? Why not stay on the ground? Safety was one reason. The cliffs were hard to reach. Enemies could not climb easily. Raiders could not sneak in. The village could see far. They spotted danger early. Water was another reason. In some canyons, springs dripped from the rock. Pools collected in stone basins. People carried water up in jars. Not much, but enough. The cliffs also held spiritual meaning. The people believed the world below was sacred. The earth was alive. The rocks held power. The ancestors lived in the stone. To live in the cliff was to be close to them. But life was hard. Water was scarce. Food was not always enough. Winters were cold. Summers were hot. Wood was heavy to carry. Children climbed ladders every day. Old people struggled. Yet, they stayed. They built. They farmed. They prayed. They raised children. They told stories. They passed on knowledge. They were not alone. Other groups lived nearby. Some were friendly, some were not. Trade happened. Shells from the ocean, turquoise from the mountains, pottery from distant villages. These things moved along trails. But by 1200, something changed. The rains failed again. The drought returned. Crops died. Trees dried. People grew hungry. At the same time, more people came. From the north, from the west. The land became crowded. Resources grew thin. Conflict rose. Then, around 1300, the villages emptied. No battle, no fire, no bones scattered. Just silence. The people left. They took their tools, their clothes, their sacred items. They left the pots on the shelves, the doors open, the ladders in place. Where did they go? We do not know for sure, but evidence shows they moved south, to the Rio Grande Valley, to Arizona, to New Mexico. They joined other Pueblo groups. They built new villages. They kept their ways. The cliff dwellings stood empty. Centuries passed. Then, in the 1800s, explorers found them. Cowboys, surveyors, scientists. They climbed up. They looked inside. They took photos. They wrote reports. People called them cliff dwellers. They thought the builders were lost, forgotten, vanished. But they were not gone. Their descendants still live, in pueblos along rivers, in towns with names like Zuni, Hopi, Acoma. They keep the old ways. They speak the old languages. They honor the ancestors. The cliff dwellings are not tombs. They are homes. Homes left behind. Homes that still speak. This is their story, and it is not over. The hands that built the cliff dwellings were strong. They worked with stone, wood, and mud. They had no metal tools, no wheels, no animals to carry loads. They used what the land gave, and they shaped it with care. Every stone was chosen, not just any rock. They picked sandstone. It splits easily. It is soft when first taken from the ground. It hardens in the air. They broke it into blocks. They shaped it with harder stones. They pounded the edges smooth. They mixed mud with water. They added straw. This made mortar. It held the stones together. They layered it between blocks. They smoothed the walls with their hands. They painted some walls with red or white clay. The homes were built into alcoves. These are natural caves in the cliff, formed by water cutting through soft rock. The roof of the alcove protected from rain. The back wall was solid stone. The sides were high. They built rooms from the back forward. First the back wall, then side walls, then the front. Doorways were left between rooms. Sometimes a stone slab was used as a door. It could be slid shut. Rooms were small, about the size of a small bedroom. Floors were packed earth or stone. Roofs were made of logs, brush, and mud. Logs were placed across the top. Then smaller sticks were laid on top. Then a layer of mud. This made a solid ceiling. It also kept out rain. Some rooms had no windows. Light came from the doorway or from the roof. Smoke from fires escaped from small holes. They built upwards, not just out. They stacked rooms on top of each other. The roof of one room became the floor of the next. They used wooden beams to support the weight. These beams were called vigas. They were cut from pine trees. Some came from forests miles away. How did they carry the wood? They cut trees in the mountains. They trimmed the branches. They dragged the logs on the ground. They tied them to sleds made of branches. People pulled them. It took days. Then, at the cliff, they raised the logs up. How? We do not know for sure, but one way was with ramps. They built dirt ramps against the cliff. They rolled logs up. Another way was with ropes. They tied ropes to the logs. People on top pulled. People below pushed. Ladders were used to move between levels. They were made of wood. Rungs were tied to side poles. They were not fixed. They could be pulled up for safety. Water was carried in jars. Women and children did this work. They walked to springs or pools. They filled large olas. These were wide pots with narrow necks. They balanced them on their heads or carried them in nets. Food was grown on the mesa top. That is the flat land above the cliff. They planted maize, beans, and squash. These were the three main crops. They planted in small fields. They used digging sticks. They weeded by hand. They watched for birds and animals.
They stored food in sealed rooms. These were called storage bins. They lined them with plaster. They kept rodents out. They stored dried corn, beans, seeds, dried meat. They made tools from stone, axes, knives, scrapers. They shaped them by hitting with another stone. This is called flint knapping. They made arrowheads, spear points. They drilled holes in shells for beads. They made clothing from animal hides, deer, rabbit. They tanned the hides. They cut them into shapes. They sewed with sinew, that is, animal tendon. They wore robes, sandals, belts. They made pottery by hand, no wheel. They coiled long ropes of clay. They built the pot upward. They smoothed the surface. They painted with natural pigments, black from charcoal, white from clay. They fired the pots in open fires. Pottery styles changed over time. Early pots were gray, simple. Later, they painted designs, black on white, zigzags, triangles, birds. These designs may have had meaning, but we do not know what they meant. They also made baskets, from yucca fiber, from reeds. They wove them tight. They used them to carry food, to winnow grain, to store seeds. The kiva was the heart of spiritual life. It was round, built below ground, entered by a ladder through a hole in the roof. The floor was lower than the surrounding rooms. Inside, there was a fire pit, for warmth, for light, for ceremony. There were benches along the wall. A small hole in the floor was the sipupu. It represented the place of emergence, where the people came from the world below. Kivas were not for everyone. Only certain men could enter, or those being taught. Women might enter for some ceremonies, but not all. Ceremonies included prayer, song, dance, offerings. They asked for rain, for good crops, for health, for balance. They believed in spirits, in the power of nature, in the ancestors. They did not worship one god. Their beliefs were tied to the land, to the sky, to the cycles of life. They marked the sun's path. They built towers or stones to track solstices, the longest day, the shortest day. They knew when to plant, when to harvest. They lived in balance. But balance is fragile. By 1100, Choco Canyon was failing. The great houses stood empty. The roads were quiet. The drought had taken its toll. Trees were cut. Soil was worn. People moved. Some went to Mesa Verde, to the cliffs, to the alcoves. They built new villages, more compact, more defensible, more efficient. They built Cliff Palace. It had over 150 rooms, 23 kivas. It was the largest cliff dwelling. It was built in a huge alcove, protected from weather, hidden from view. They built Spruce Tree House, Balanced House, Oak Tree House. Each was unique. Each fit the shape of the rock. They built check dams, small walls across slopes, to slow water, to stop erosion, to help plants grow. They built reservoirs, pits lined with clay to catch rainwater. They farmed on the mesa, but the soil was thin. Rain was not reliable. One dry year could mean hunger. They hunted deer, rabbit, turkey. They used bows and arrows. They set traps. They gathered wild plants, nuts, berries, seeds, yucca,
cactus fruit. Life was full, but it was hard. By 1250, signs of stress appear. Trash piles grow, more broken pots, more animal bones. This may mean more people or less care. Burials show signs of disease. Some bones have marks of malnutrition. Children died young. There is evidence of violence. Some skulls show wounds. Some villages have ditches or walls, signs of fear. Trade slows. Fewer shells, less turquoise, less pottery from far away. The climate turns dry again. Tree rings show little rain. Lakes shrink. Springs dry. The people face a choice. Stay and risk starvation, or leave. They had done this before. They knew how to move. But leaving meant leaving home, leaving the kivas, leaving the graves, leaving the stories. It was not a light decision. But around 1280, they began to leave. Not all at once, not in panic, in groups, over time. They took what they could carry: tools, clothing, sacred items, seeds. They left the heavy pots, the stone tools, the ladders. They did not burn the homes. They did not destroy them. They simply walked away. The last fire went out. The last footstep faded. The wind moved in. The silence returned. But the buildings remained, and they tell a story of skill, a story of faith, a story of endurance, of a people who built in stone, who lived with the sky, who honored the earth. They were not primitive. They were not simple. They were thoughtful, resourceful, deeply connected to their world. And when that world changed, they changed with it. They did not vanish. They moved. They survived. And their descendants remember.
Water ruled their lives. It fell from the sky. It flowed in streams. It seeped from rock. It hid in soil. Without it, nothing grew. Without it, no one lived. The ancestral Puebloans knew this. They watched the clouds. They listened to the wind. They studied the land. They lived in a dry place. Rain did not come every year. Some years, it did not come at all. They had to find water, store it, protect it, share it. In the early years, they lived on mesa tops. They farmed in open fields. They dug pits to catch rain. They built small dams to slow runoff. But as villages grew, demand rose. More people, more crops, more animals. Then came the drought. Tree ring data shows a great drought from 1130 to 1180. That is 50 years of little rain. Lakes dried, springs slowed, crops failed. People left Chaco Canyon. They moved to places with better water. Some went to the cliffs. Mesa Verde had alcoves. But more important, it had seeps. Water that dripped slowly from the rock. It collected in pools. It fed small plants. They built villages near these seeps. They dug basins to catch the water. They lined them with clay. They covered them to keep dust out. They carried water up to the dwellings. Jars held 10 to 15 gallons. A full jar weighed over 100 pounds. Women and children made the trip many times a day. They could not waste a drop. They used water for drinking, for cooking, for mixing mortar, for growing plants. They bathed rarely. They cleaned with sand or ash. They planted maize in places where water would flow. They built check dams, small stone walls across slopes. These slowed water, let it soak into the soil, helped crops grow. They planted beans and squash with maize. The beans climbed the corn, the squash covered the ground. This saved moisture, reduced weeds.
They stored seeds from good years in case of bad years. But water was not just physical, it was sacred. They prayed for rain, they performed ceremonies, they offered corn, they sang songs. The kiva was a place of water prayer. The sipapu symbolized the source of life, the place where water and people began. Rain clouds were seen as messengers, lightning was powerful, thunder was the voice of spirits. They did not control water, they respected it. But respect could not make it rain. By 1270, tree rings show another drought, worse than the first. It lasted 23 years, very little rain. Rivers shrank, springs dried. This drought hit at a bad time. The land was already crowded. People had moved to Mesa Verde. Villages grew, more demand for water. Then more people came, from the north, from the west. They were also fleeing drought. They brought their families, their animals, their needs. Competition grew. Some villages show signs of conflict. Walls, watchtowers, weapons. Human remains from this time show trauma. Skulls with fractures, bones with arrow points. This was not constant war, but tension was high. People had to choose. Fight for water or leave. Leaving was hard. The cliff dwellings were built with great effort. Generations lived there. Ancestors were buried nearby. The kivas held sacred power. To leave was to break ties. But staying could mean death. They had done this before. They knew how to move. They packed seeds, tools, clothing, sacred items. They left the heavy pots, the stone metates, the ladders. They walked south, to the Rio Grande, to the Little Colorado, to the Hopi mesas. These places had rivers, more reliable water, more space. They built new pueblos, on the ground, near water. They kept their ways, their language, their beliefs. The cliff dwellings stood empty. But water still dripped in the alcoves. It still pooled in the basins. It still whispered down the stone. And it still tells the story of a people who lived by water, who prayed for it, who carried it, who followed it. When it left, they followed. They did not fight the land, they listened to it, and they moved. They did not vanish, they did not die, they did not flee in fear. They left, one by one, family by family, group by group. They packed what they could carry. They took seeds, tools, clothing, sacred items. They left the stone homes, the pottery, the ladders. They closed no doors, they burned no bridges. They simply walked away. This was not sudden. It happened over decades. From 1250 to 1300, people left Mesa Verde and other cliff sites. They went south to where water flowed, where land was open. They joined other Pueblo groups. They built new pueblos on the ground, near water. They kept their ways, their language, their beliefs. The cliff dwellings stood empty. But water still dripped in the alcoves. It still pooled in the basins. It still whispered down the stone. And it still tells the story of a people who lived by water, who prayed for it, who carried it, who followed it. When it left, they followed. They did not fight the land, they listened to it, and they moved.
They followed the signs. They followed their elders. No written records, no dates, but oral tradition tells of a time of change, of a journey south, of a new beginning. Archaeology supports this. Sites in New Mexico and Arizona show new construction at this time. Pottery styles match those from Mesa Verde. Burial practices are similar. Language links exist. The people did not disappear. They transformed. They adapted. They survived. And the cliff dwellings? They became silent, but not forgotten. Their descendants remember. They tell the stories. They honor the ancestors. They visit the sites. They pray. The departure was not the end.
It was a change, a turning point, a new chapter. The cliff dwellings still stand. Wind moves through them. Light falls on the walls. Shadows grow long, but no voices answer. The people are gone, yet they are not lost. Their skill is in the stone. Their care is in the mortar. Their spirit is in the kiva. They built to last, not for us, for their children, for the next season, for the next generation. They did not know we would come. They did not build for tourists. They built for life, for safety, for community, for prayer. And when life changed, they changed. They did not cling. They did not fight. They moved with dignity, with purpose, with hope. We walk where they walked. We see what they built. We touch what they touched. And for a moment, we feel them, not as ghosts, but as people, like us, who loved, who worked, who prayed, who lived. And when the time came, they left. The cliffs hold their story, not in words, but in stone, in silence, in light. Listen, they are still speaking.